Welcome to the Subconscious Photography Podcast, where art meets science, reality meets perception, all through the lens of a camera. Now, ready your lenses, open your minds, and let's delve into the fascinating world of subconscious photography. Is this thing on? Okay, is this thing on? Is this thing on? Hello, everyone. I want to take this moment to introduce this particular episode because it really is our first substantive episode. We had a trailer, we had an episode that set the stage, but this episode, as you can tell, has a guest, and I wanted to interrupt the hijinks that took place at the beginning of this interview just to set it up for you all. My guest today, and in the next episode, because we ran our mouths for so long that I had to cut this episode into 2 episodes. So my guest is Scott Whitham, a longtime friend of mine, former neighbor, and what I guess people would call in today's parlance a freelance creator. Really, he's a filmmaker, but not a YouTuber, a real filmmaker. And he has served in the roles of director of photography, director, producer, writer, and every other possible job you can have on a set. And to try and categorize Scott would be like to try and categorize Ansel Adams by saying he was a landscape photographer. In any event, Scott does short form and long form commercial work. And I don't just mean commercial work in the sense that he gets paid for it. I mean commercials, short form commercials, meaning, spots, 30-second spots you might see on TV. He also does long form commercial work for companies regarding products which take on a more documentary-like feel. You will hear in this episode that Scott describes his style as cinema verité, and I'll let him describe what he means by that. But suffice to say, he likes the style of trying to mount a camera on a wall and letting things happen and unfold naturally without trying to make the camera the focus of the viewer, but instead the camera serves as the eyes of the viewer, and the people who are in the film are the subjects of these films. And his films and commercial work try to dissolve what Shakespeare, I believe, called the fourth wall, meaning the wall that everybody knows, or window that everybody knows, exists between the audience and the actors. I would describe Scott's style as trying to use the camera to break down the wall between the viewer and, I'll say actors, but the people who are in his films. In addition to doing commercial work, Scott is also a documentarian and a filmmaker documentarian. Scott is the driving force, director, producer, in some instances the narrator of a forthcoming, already award-winning documentary entitled Burden of Memory, subtitled Determination Can Alter Fate. And I will leave a link in the show notes to the website and to the movie trailer. But in short, the documentary follows the life of Lieutenant Colonel William Benelli of the Army Air Corps, who served as a B-17 squadron leader, flew many military sorties over Europe and Germany, but he in fact started the war at Pearl Harbor on Pearl Harbor Day, and he eventually learned to fly a B-17, became a squadron leader, and was transferred to the European theater, where he flew bombing missions over Europe and Germany. So he's one of a handful of World War II veterans who served in both the Pacific and the European theater during World War II. And as the website says, this isn't just a war story. It's a story about a person who just happened to be in a war. If two sentences could sum up what I think Scott's style as a creator is about, what his point of view is, it would be in those two sentences. It's not just a war story. It's not just a story about something that happened to a person. It's also a story about a person and their life, and the fact that they happen to be born during that time where they had to serve in a war, and a big war, and what the memories of that war do to shape and transform not just your present when you're in the war, but your future and how you live your life after the war. Like I said, I will leave links in the description to the website and the trailer. So just to wrap this part up, instead of calling Scott a creator, I think what we should call him is a storyteller, because that's what he does. He tells great stories, and he lets the stories speak for themselves. And today we have with us a special guest, Scott Whitham, a former neighbor of mine, friend of mine, whiskey drinking buddy of mine, a man who first taught me the appreciation of good wine, how to store it, how to drink it, and how to do a bankrupt while buy it. In addition to all that, Scott actually, for a profession and to pay his born bill, works in what I'll call generally in the creative field. Very experienced still photographer, but more experienced, I'm going to say, movie photographer, because Scott came over and looked at a couple of my Bolex movie cameras and said that he learned on those in school. So, Scott, with that introduction and knowing that you're older than dinosaurs, can you give our listeners a little background about yourself? Well, first of all, thanks for dating me in terms of the whole Bolex thing. There's a whole world of people that go, huh? What the heck is a Bolex, right? Which ironically, they did resurrect a few years ago. They came out with a digital Bolex, as you recall, which unfortunately failed, which was a shame because it was a very cool camera that I thought was trying to sort of marry film and digital media together. And there's still a couple of those cameras floating around out there, but that's not the question you asked me. You asked me about who I am, and I guess my name rank is the number. Yes, Colonel Klink, I will tell you. First of all, I didn't realize how much of an influence I had on your alcoholism, so I apologize for that. Or maybe don't. Maybe I don't apologize for that. No, there's no need to apologize for that, because before that, I was an alcoholic, but I was drinking cheap wine, cheap beer, and hadn't yet discovered my taste for single malt whiskey. Right. Or farniente, or, whatever wine that costs more than $15 a bottle you care to mention, right? So I guess, they get filmmaking, right? So, because that's what I am. I'm a filmmaker. And I think I got interested in filmmaking, first of all, because my dad was a big movie buff. And, he was watching the typical fodder that guys of his age were watching back then in the 60s and 70s. He was watching crime dramas, war films, adventure, action films, spy movies. I mean, James Bond was a huge part of my youth, and, those were the few times that I remember actually spending quality time with my dad, is when we would sit and watch a movie together. And those moments became sort of, I guess, kind of sacred for me. And so, of course, a lot of those films have become sort of part of my sort of collective background. And I guess, back in the days before there was even videotape, I had a little audio cassette recorder. And as a way to, I guess, to sort of capture that moment of that film, whether it was, whatever film it was we were watching at the time, my dad and I would put a little cassette recorder next to the speaker of the TV, and I'd record the movie. But it was audio. Remember, this is in the days before even VCRs, and that gave me a huge insight into how important, first of all, sound was to the visual image. Okay. I mean, I know this is something, where this is a podcast about photography, but for my purposes of what I do as a filmmaker, what I realized is how sound is, and they say sound is 70% of the picture. And I believe it's even more than that. Because I would be able to sit and listen to these movies. Like I would listen to, like, say, for example, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, right? I mean, who doesn't know that film of a certain age, right? And, everybody's familiar with the music, but what also blew me away was the way in which the director used sound effects as these sort of harbingers of things that were about to happen. And for example, like right before, somebody was going to pull a gun, a coyote would howl. And I noticed this repeated constantly in these movies. And I'm like, wow, like they're kind of telling you, when you're watching a movie as an entire experience, as an audio and visual experience, you're not conscious of it, right? But then when I was listening to it in the crude ways that I was listening to it back then, because I only had an audio recording, it gave me a whole nother appreciation of what sound did and the dimension it brought.
So no doubt, Sergio Leone was a great director, but also a great musical director.
Absolutely. And in fact, he was one of the first, or I shouldn't say the first, but he was definitely an early proponent of playing music on set when they were filming. Because if you have to remember back then when they were making, since we're on this whole bend now of, say, Sergio Leone and the Italian westerns, spaghetti westerns, none of those films were shot with sound. They never recorded a soundtrack when they filmed those because those were international productions. And the way they were thrown together via financing was some of it came from Greece, some of it came from Italy, some of it came from England, some of it came from the United States. All of these different countries were contributing financing to make these movies, and the ways in which they would make that film palatable to an international audience is that they would put a star in, say, from Greece. Now, in America, nobody knew who that person was, but to a Greek audience, that guy or that woman was famous in that country. And so everybody during the production of those films spoke in their own language. And that's why when you watch those movies, you're like, their lips aren't white matching up to the English. It's because they weren't speaking English. You had an actor talking to Clint Eastwood in Dutch, let's say, and he just knew that when that guy or that woman ended talking, it was his turn to start saying his lines in English. Or you had a French actor speaking in French. Everybody just spoke their own language, and they didn't record any location sound. So all of the sound that you hear in those movies was dubbed later on. Sound effects, everything. And so because of that, Leone felt free to play music on set to get actors into the mood. And so he would have, of course, his favorite composer, Ennio Morricone, would write most of the music before a single frame of the film was shot. And then he would bring a tape player with loudspeakers on the set and play the music for them when they were filming certain scenes so that they kind of got sort of what was in his head, the director's head, into the mood of what this sort of the final film was going to sort of look like and more importantly, sound like. Sound is really was sort of my entree into understanding the larger picture now, shall we say, somewhat euphemistically, of how to tell a story, because you could tell a lot with actually very little. And that was also one of the other great things about, listening to a film, listening to your way through a film, was to realize how much the music was telling you what was going on without the filmmaker having to use dialogue or even necessarily pictures, and also to sort of give you a sense of what the character was thinking beyond even what you could see visually.
So, that's interesting because most of all, I always wondered why their mouths were not synced with the audio. I never knew that there was no on-location sound in those movies. But in addition, like your point about sound being 70% of the movie, and when you went back and listened to them, you could tell that when the wolf howled, the gun was about to come out. And how sound is used as not just a mood setter, but for foreshadowing and to locate you, right? Because you can come into a scene, not know what country you're in, but play music that would get the viewer a hint about where you are. And so that really ties into one of the two main issues I wanted to ask you about, which is how perception is affected by your subconscious, because that's really what you're talking about, right? When you listen to the movie without the pictures, your subconscious pays more attention because there's no moving image for you to look at while you're listening. And so you learn faster that when you hear the wolf howl, here comes the god. Right. So I guess my larger question is, how much do you as a filmmaker think about the sound and the way people are going to perceive the sound and the picture at the same time?
I'd be lying if I said that it's always an immediate consideration in the moment, but that's also because it's the style of filmmaking that I prefer and that I sort of ascribe to is what is called sort of verité filmmaking. Okay, and verité is a fancy French word that came out of filmmaking in the 50s and 60s. That basically means cinema of the moment. And what that means is you're an observer, okay, and you're not trying to overly choreograph a moment. You're trying to let a moment happen in the way that it should happen authentically at that time. And let your fly on the yeah. I mean, it's the best documentaries and talking about people who definitely ascribe to that sort of filmmaking ethos. There's very, very probably the most famous documentarian filmmakers of ever, the Maisel brothers, of which they're still alive, believe it or not. These guys basically wrote the art of documentary filmmaking and have made some incredible documentaries. They believe and still believe, and there's a whole school of documentarians' thought on the way they choose to make their films, is that you don't interfere with anything that's going on in the moment. You try to recede into the background as much as possible. You don't ask questions. You let the people, or whatever that moment is that you're observing, happen in real time. And even to the point where they have said that, Maisels have said that, the fewer edits, the fewer cuts, the better, because you're presenting a pure, authentic version of that moment going on. Because ultimately, even though, let's just say, for example, as a documentary filmmaker versus, say, a narrative filmmaker, and, narrative film is basically, it's scripted with actors, the scenes are rehearsed, the dialogue is gone over again and again with a fine-tooth comb, and you do it as many times as you have to do it till you get it the way you want it. Versus documentary, which people say is authentic. The minute you choose to point a camera in a direction, you have created a point of view that you have edited for the viewer. Okay? So you are making a conscious choice of what you want people to know and what you want people to see. So then it's in typical flauntry and satire taking like photojournalism in wartime, right? You crop with your feet, you get closer or as close as you can to the subject, and whatever's happening on the side, that's not really in the picture. So, yeah. Also, I know you know, long before Lightroom and Photoshop existed, people changed negatives. They cropped really tight to crop things out that were going on all over. And so then the question becomes actually twofold. One is, what's the difference between analog editing in a darkroom or editing a film by splicing things in and out, and lightering
Photoshop post-processing. And then the second question is, do you still consider that to be truthful? Because, well, like you said, once you pick the spot, you're going to set the camera up. Even if you don't ever move it, you've still chosen a point of view. It reminds me on the narrow side of Hitchcock's film, Growth, where he shot in one take. And he just let the camera roll. But he followed the characters around, adding move the cameras. So it was like a fly on the wall, but it was still sort of artificial.
Yeah, Robe, I don't want to go too far down a road and get off subject, but Robe is one of those, I will say, Hitchcock was a great director, but also B, a great technical director. And I have found that the best directors kind of combine both. Like they have the element of storytelling, but they also will embrace new ways of narrative storytelling. And I think that what he tried to do with Robe, and what I thought it was successful as a technical achievement, was that he made you feel like, you're witnessing this thing in real time by making it seem like the camera never cut. It did, of course, cut. It cut multiple times. It had to, because of the technical limitations of the day. A typical film camera of that time period, which was, I think, like the late 1940s, maybe I think had like 10 to 15 minutes worth of film in it. And so what they had to know was like the actors had to be blocked or staged in certain ways that when the camera was about to run out of film, somebody would walk in front of the camera, block the shot, and then they'd reset, and then the camera would come out from behind that person again. And to the viewer, it felt like one continuous stream of motion, but there was an effect of cut. And it's a trick as old as film itself. I mean, Sam Mendes did it beautifully in the movie 1917. And yet, beautifully, but there's a lot of digital trickery that was available to him that wasn't available to Hitchcock. I mean, theoretically, he could have shot that entire film in one take, because with digital media now, you have literally unlimited run times when you hit record, but it just was technically unachievable because of the sheer vastness of the sets and the stories and the times of day and all the extras and everything. That there are, I think, if I'm not mistaken, at least a half a dozen cut points in that film that he mentions, Sam Mendes, the director, mentions, but he won't tell you where they are. He leaves it up to you to sort of figure it out. So I think, getting, again, not trying to go fall too far off a ledge here, but I think that, when getting back to your original thing about, the subconscious aspects and choices that we make, I feel like what's subconscious about it is your innate taste and experience. But when you go to pick up a camera to point it at something, it is a very conscious decision that is being made to, again, put it in a certain direction, what you choose to limit that the frame sees. When we're talking about context in a way, right? And contextuality and photography is everything. It's about, I think you had shared with me the last time I was here, I think it was a newspaper article in the Times, and it was a guy, I think, who was a curator of a museum in New York, which I'm not even going to try and remember what it was, but, I think he had a very sort of highbrow opinion of photography, which was, it was the art of pointing. And I thought it was like the nicest thing he could say about photography, because he came from a school of, I guess, more classical art, and that it had to be something that, required a brush or some sort of manual dexterity, sculpting or chiseling or clay or paper mache or whatever. But of course he's wrong, in my opinion, because all art has to start with, an idea, and an idea is something that hits you in a moment as something that you observe that no one else sees, that you want to bring the world's or people's eyes and attention to. And a camera does that in the same way that your hands can do that by putting a brush onto, against a piece of canvas, let's say, or taking clay and throwing it at a stick until it takes shape into the thing that your head sees that you want other people to see. And a camera is that same extension. It's a more modern extension of that ability.
So this isn't done. This of your comments about observation, because as some of my listeners know, in addition to being fascinated with all things image making, I'm also somewhat fascinated by the idea of quantum physics. And so when you talk to me about observation, that reminds me of Schrodinger's infamous cat, right? So until somebody observes the cat, it's neither dead nor alive because no one is seeing it, right? Or the analogy to sound, if the tree falls in a forest and there's no one there's no one there to hear it, it didn't make any noise, right? And so the issue about observation, I think, is a valid one, because if you don't observe it as the filmmaker or the photographer and make an image, I'm not sure it had it. I mean, you witnessed it. But as a lawyer, I'll tell you, your eyewitness testimony is the worst evidence known to mankind, right? Like, you're stopped at a red light, somebody rear ends you, and they say, well, you had the green light, why were you standing still? And you proceeded completely differently. The light was always red for you. There's no way to really solve that other than if you had a photo or a video. So how much of the shooter's observation affects the end product?
I'd say it's everything. I mean, I'd say, first of all, getting back to something you talked about earlier about, perspective, point of view, just because you see something or you witness something doesn't necessarily make it true. Like that's what I call and what's referred to typically as like the Rashomon effect, right? It's like where certain people, same person, or sorry, not same person, but it's like three people see the exact same thing happen and all have a completely different description of what they actually saw. And I think that in and of itself, though, speaks to the subconscious mind, okay? And, you're taking input from what you were witnessing and you are processing it, okay, through your own chemical bath of criteria based on, and you're simultaneously, you're already editing it in your head because you're editing it on what precepts you have on believability, on truth, on what makes sense to you in that moment, what else you might have been thinking of when this thing suddenly caught your attention. Because, and I'll give you a perfect example of what I'm talking about, because I have often found, for me, that the greatest moments of inspiration come from things that I misread, that I don't hear correctly. And I've heard people say things to me that I thought it was not even close to what they said to me, but it made my mind start to think in another direction. And that became something for me that became a type of inspiration to whether it was something that I was going to write or something I was going to photograph, an idea that I was going to pitch to somebody, a client or whatever. But I mean, often misinterpreting things, I think, actually gives us access to stuff that we wouldn't think about otherwise.
Well, and I'll just tell you, as a lawyer, when I prepare people to be deposed, I tell them, if you honestly don't know the answer to a question, just say you don't know. But people are afraid to say they don't know something that they feel like they should know. And then they end up making up the answer to a question. And I say making it up because it might not be a lie intended to deceive the questioner. I mean, the question might be, what's your anniversary? And in that moment, the person who's answering the question can't remember the date of their anniversary, and the date gives the wrong date. Now, we lawyers will make a whole bunch about a witness who can't remember the date of his own anniversary. And notice I said it's because it's always the men. But that is evidence of what your brain does, which is you've heard a question and you feel like you must know the answer to it, but you can't say it at the moment. And rather than saying I don't know, or to avoid embarrassment, your brain fills in the details. I mean, you're touching on a lot of things here, which, I have a lot of varying thoughts on, but I think that one of the things that you're mentioning just right now, specifically when you're talking about people sort of filling in the blanks with information that they don't really know, I think a lot of that is, I'm trying to think of the word that I wanted to use for it because I had it and it just completely escaped my mind. But I think a lot of it is, it's not ignorance so much as the word that I'm looking for. Oh, it's pride, and that maybe still is not the exact word that I was looking for. But I think, I said it's like fear, yeah, or whatever, and I mean, let's face it. I mean, like, I think a lot of us humans risk our way through our lives. Okay. But a lot of that risk isn't noise. I mean, it's well thought out, maybe not necessarily in the moment, but this gets back to what I was saying before, how someone can say something that inadvertently influences you because you heard it wrong and you ascribe some different kind of set of criteria to it that it wasn't meant to be, but then you take that and you make it your own. And that's part of creativity, right? It's like, it's inspiration. It's however inspiration comes at you. It's the idea of people saying, well, that's been done before, but it's always like, well, but again, getting back to the idea of the frame and how you point the camera. It's like you move it 2 inches to the left and it becomes a completely different idea. And I'll give you an example of that. Perfect example I saw of it. Actually, a famous cinematographer describing this moment. He was working with Roman Polanski on the movie Rosemary's Baby. And there was a scene where this character goes to answer a phone call. And the camera is looking at it sort of from the first person perspective of somebody who's watching the person on the phone. And the cameraman set up the shot, right? And in the shot, you can see the character in the deep background in the bedroom talking on the phone, right? And Polanski looked at the shot and said, move the camera 2 inches to the left. And the cameraman said, yeah, but if I do that, we won't see them. And he said, exactly. Okay. And the cameraman was like, well, so why? And he said, I have my reasons. So the film is finished. They had the premiere. The director of photography was invited to the premiere. And when that scene came up, and you see the character who's looking at this person walk into the room, and that subjectivity of that character wanting to listen to what that conversation was, and the director of photography said, everybody in the audience went like this. They leaned over, like they could actually physically alter the space and time of that moment and make it a 3D situation where they could peek around the corner to hear this conversation. That is brilliant, number one, because that director understood his audience and what they would innately want to know in that moment because they had already told you that whatever this person's talking about, because it was in a whisper, is something that this other person wanted to hear. So, being able to control those kinds of moments just by shifting the camera, the perspective of the camera just an inch made all the difference in controlling people's responses to what happened there. And I think, you had touched on sort of the idea of people's, the way they respond to imagery, and, the subjectiveness and the subconsciousness of the way in which people respond to something. I mean, it's like wine is a perfect example. Okay. People can drink the same glass of wine, and one person goes, yeah, I taste grapes. Maybe, they're a little sour, whatever. And then the next person sits there and goes, there's some mineralness to it. And they can actually break down like the mineral composition and tell you what the soil was like and say, yes. And it's flinty. And I'm like, okay, leathery. And you're going like, how do people do that? And some people they're just wired differently to things within their brain that allow them to pick up on cues in things. And it's not that any one person is greater or lesser than the other. It's just that their acuity to those sorts of things is just different. It's that 2 inches of that camera to the left and knowing that that's going to make the difference. With regard to that scene of Rosemary's Baby, I never knew that story, but I find it amazing that people were leaning over as if their line of sight would make them able to hear a conversation in a whisper anyway, right? Right, because if the conversation was loud enough to overhear, it doesn't matter whether the person's in your line of sight or not. So when you think about it, it really was sort of some experiential trickery, because the only reason why the people leaned over was because the shot was a shot of an empty row. Right. You could hear the person, couldn't see them. And you could just kind of, what you could hear were like certain keywords, like, you'd hear like, worse, it's here, in the other room, and then, and maybe the person, of course, in the other room who was listening want to go, what are they talking about? And leaning over, and to think, even then, because this was a movie that was made in the late 1960s, 3D animation didn't exist. The idea of 3 dimensions in a movie theater didn't exist. So to think that you could actually create a 3D experience in a movie theater back then, that you could get people to lean over to think that they could change the perspective of what they were watching, because it would make a difference not only in what they could see, but what they could hear, was, again, just brilliant and insightful. But it also took into account human nature, which I think is extremely important in storytelling, and any kind of storytelling. And when I say storytelling, I'm not just talking about linearly with a movie or whatever. I mean, we you walk into a room, that room tells you a story. Okay, it tells you a story about that person's life, about what they value, about what's important to them, about what's not important to them. Okay. You see a person coming down the street, you look at how they're dressed, you watch how they walk, you watch, do they look down at the ground, do they make eye contact with you, everything tells a story. And so all those choices are important in adding up to a great big something. And that gets back to what I was telling you about listening to the sound in that film, that spaghetti western, in my room when I was 10 years old, and dissecting it apart and realizing that, all of these elements are telling me something, even if I am not aware of it. And it's like, and to get back to the whole idea, like for example, music, like music in film is still a much misunderstood, often maligned and underappreciated art form because, first of all, I think most films these days have way too much music because I feel like it's working so hard to try and make you feel a certain way. And it's like, if you go back and you watch movies that were made 40, 50, 60 years ago, there's not a lot of music in it. Yeah, there's not a lot of music in it. And that was done on purpose because the filmmakers, trusted their audience. And also they trusted in their own abilities as a storyteller to say, I'm going to let people figure this out for themselves. And I think that what we do too much these days is we baby bird stuff for people. And I've been guilty of that because, look, I make my living in the world of advertising and paid media. And so, sometimes you have to just say, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to show you. And then I'm going to show you. And then I'm going to tell you what I just showed you. I mean, there's a certain element of that has to be put into, commerce, I'll say, aspect of commerce that's involved in storytelling. But ultimately, I think that what's the most interesting part of storytelling is letting people, and again, this goes back to the Rashomon effect, right? Let them see it for themselves and let them decide what they want to take away from it. Okay. And so to maintain that type of objectivity as a storyteller in order to present that to a person to get what they want out of it is an extremely difficult thing to do. So Len asked you about, for Rashomon, about truth and AI. I can cut that all into one blast. So typically people view photographs, and I mean photographs, like in the car accident example, if there's a surveillance camera and 3 different people have testified that they see 3 different things, typically people will use the surveillance footage or a photograph as the tiebreaker. Right? And most of the time, the video or the photograph, it doesn't add up to any one of the 3 observers, right? It's all for the observer. And because the camera's in a certain place, but doesn't necessarily mean that the people who testified differently were lying. It just means they perceived it from a different angle, a different point of view. But the photograph or the video will generally depict what everybody saw. The red car, the blue car, the color of the traffic light. And so for that reason, people generally ascribe to photos or videos that that's the truth, right? And look, obviously we know, look, from the dawn of photography, people have been scraping stuff off of negatives before they print it or tight cropping it or removing people. But people still view analog and digital photography as a slice of a moment in time. This is documentation of what took place on Monday at 12:55. Right? So now you have AI. We were just watching some of those Sora example videos, and the video of the woman walking down a street, presumably in Tokyo, Hong Kong. That never happened. That is not documentation of what happened on Monday night at midnight. That's a cartoon. It's a painting that came out of somebody's mind, but it is not very or documentary in any way. I guess the real question is, if we all agree that all of these things are tools, right? The camera's a tool. The BS stuff doesn't matter, right? Like, it doesn't matter what lens you have. Of course, my favorite quote, the best camera is the one you have with you. Right? Without a camera, right, you're not doing anything. So I'm interested to know from your point of view, particularly as a documentarian, what you view this AI tool as being for the future of sort of truth-telling in documentaries.
I think using your example of photography, a visual image, whatever, as the definitive truth, the absolute truth, and let's say, did so and so stumble on the 50-yard line, or did this car actually go on the red light, or whatever. I think involves a bit of hubris, and I think because what I think that all of these tools that we use to share moments, tell stories, there's a great bit of ego that is involved. And by that, what I mean is, I think that we view things in the ways in which we want to view them, and we take in what we want to based on our own ego. That is to say, our prejudices, okay, on how we think the world should be seen based on how our two eyeballs observe something, based on previous experience, based on our feelings in the moment, based on the weather, based on the light, based on what we just ate, the fight we maybe just had with somebody over the phone. All of those things prejudice us to how we experience something. And all of those things add up to what I believe is what I refer to anyway as our ego. And that ego is the thing that makes us look at something like AI and go, that's bullshit. That's not real. That didn't happen. Because you could break it down and say, it didn't happen at that place, at that night in Tokyo at midnight. That woman is not real. But it's a construct based on input. And that input came from a person who wrote code, who gave it human attributes. And so did it happen in the way that our ego allows us to want to believe that it happened? And our ego says no, because that person is not real. But is it a construct of something that was initiated by an action? Electronic, code-based, whatever? Undeniably, yes. All right, so let me ask the question this way, because I understand what you're saying, and I do agree with you. It's a construct, and somebody had to prompt it, and somebody had to code, let's put the crosswalk in the reflection of her sunglasses. By the way, she's wearing sunglasses at night, and it's a phenomenal reflection. So they must have some really bright street lights wherever that is. But leaving that aside, which is something that all filmmakers want to do when they're filming this stuff with human beings, and is very difficult to achieve. And by the way, do you notice another film trick I noticed in that film? The street sidewalk was wet. It's always ringing in night shots, because it makes it look sexier. You get the lights bouncing up off of the ground, and it makes everything more. It gives it more dimension and more secular imagery to it. So, given all that, do you think this AI generation of video is more like PT or more like cinematography? And when I say cinematography, I mean documentary filmmaking. I don't have an answer to that. And I'll tell you why I don't have an answer to that, because I think that, when you look at this AI-generated imagery, like the stuff that we just looked like, the Sora stuff, it's totally based on stuff that we already know. Like you look at that and you say, that looks like a shot from a movie, like from a Ridley Scott movie. I look at that and I look at a movie like Black Rain, which he did with Michael Douglas back in the 80s and shot in Tokyo, right? And was shot at night in a very distinctive, everybody wearing sunglasses at night, wet down streets and everything. So that's already based on something that we know can be achievable based on the constricts of real live cinematography, barriers of location, time of day, nighttime versus daytime. So what I will say is what I'm more interested in with AI is to see what it can create that we haven't even thought of yet. How can you tell a story beyond the boundaries? Because we're still using tools that are grounded in reality to judge what an AI image looks like. Like we're saying, yes, because this looks like it was shot with a beautiful camera and a beautiful model at night. And this is how we are comparing it apples to apples in a way, because it's generative of something we've already seen done with current tools of filmmaking. But of course, that's how it was trained. Right, that's how it was trained. So what I'm interested to see is where it can take us in the terms of filmmaking that we haven't even been able to imagine yet because of the constrictions of gear, equipment, lights, people, their capabilities, and what they're able to do. So as a documentary filmmaker, what I say is, because documentary, again, different from narrative, okay, in a way, is that it will allow maybe me a way to realize moments that a person is trying to relate from their past experiences that are no longer achievable because that time has receded into the background, okay, through time, whatever. And now we're getting into the whole theory of relativity and the idea of things happening out in space. Well, I take your point even without Einstein's theory, but your point about it being able to create images from people's memories where no images exist. Right. Seems to be an answer to the stock footage problem. Well, yeah, I do think that the stock footage industry is sweating bullets right now because of AI, and I wouldn't blame them for that, because, a lot of that kind of stuff seems to be very easily generated even with the existing AI technology. Like if you say, I want a shot of somebody walking on the beach, AI can whip that out. So no longer you have to have somebody go out there with a model at the right time of day, hoping that they get the right kind of light and that there's no seagull taking a dump in the background or some stupid kid splashing around with water in the background. You can completely control those elements, right? Yeah, but something you said about the democratization of photography, which of course has been the goal reportedly of photography since 1827, right? Kodak rolled the film up. First of all, any film, so you didn't have to shoot on a glass plate, and they rolled it up. I got rid of all those bots, the large format cameras. Then they put it in a holding camera that you could climb to the peak of the Everest, maybe, since they hadn't found that camera yet. It's buried in snow. I'm convinced. But all the way up to the present day, where we have pretty damn good cameras in our pockets every day. And they weren't originally designed to be cams, right? That was just like somebody was like, hey, if we can get a lens to this size, we could put a camera in here. And it was like the throwaway of cell phones, right? But the throwaway of cell phones
has had a remarkable effect. I just wanted to give you some statistics and then get your response. So without going back to 1827, let's only go back to 1999, which to me feels like yesterday. But apparently, I think we were buying wine then. You're not sure, but for that, that's like almost 25 years ago now.
Yes.
So we are old.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the question. And so in 1999, which I think Kodak considered to be the height of the roll film camera market, and that, of course, was 10 years after I left working at the mall 1 hour photo lab. So in 1999, Kodak estimated that 80 billion pictures were taken that year. But that means 80 billion negatives were processed, right? They were put in a shoebox or a drawer and forgotten, only to be opened later. And the viewer is usually horrified. But without this, there was 80 billion pictures saved. The estimate for 2023 is that 1.2 trillion photographs of some sort, be it cell phone, digital camera, film camera, were taken. And that means that over that 24, 25-year period, we increased 40, almost 46, 47 billion pictures a year in order to get from 80 billion to 1.2 trillion. As you said, just because you have the tools doesn't make it great, because Americans as a group apparently take 6 photos per day. But selfies, pet pictures, and a random scenery, which I guess is what we call now the landscape photography, made up to the 3 largest categories, followed by group pictures, of course, probably at a bar when you don't want to be in a group picture. But given that, I mean, to me, that's George Eastman's dream come true, except for the fact that he didn't believe in digital technology and bankrupted his company. But how did you see AI fitting into this tremendous amount of photo, video that's taken every single day?
Well, I will tell you one possibility, and I will tell you this because it's something that I've just been personally a witness of recently, and that is, when you talk about, let's go back to the days of film, right? All those billions of pictures being taken every year, right? And the categories that you just described now that the average person is taking ostensibly were pretty much the same things that were being taken back then. Let's say, yeah. So, we're not going to call art photography. We're not going to call creative photography. We're going to just say, snapshots, like you said. It's a perfect word. So I recently became custodian of my parents' entire collection of photographs, okay? A lot of which had been curated over the years by my mother, put in nice photo books. My brothers and sisters broken down into their years, their younger years, their older years, pictures of my parents' wedding. And yet, with all of that curation that she did in her life, my mother, she had shoebox after shoebox after cardboard box after plastic container of whatever vessel you want to describe, filled with photos and negatives in paper envelopes. And for people listening to this who don't remember those times, that's when you got your film processed at the local drugstore or the photo mat or whatever, you got your negatives back in a little slot in the front, and then you got your print in there as well. You get doubles, whatever, white border, borderless, matte, glossies,
but 4x3, 5x5, 8x10, whatever. And so I've taken it upon myself to go through these photographs, okay? And these were photographs that were taken late in my parents' lives, so this is after like all the kids had moved out and whatnot, and they were retired and whatnot. First of all, and this is really not necessary to tell the story, but I'm going to say it anyway. My mother, God bless her, one of the worst photographers ever, okay, had the uncanny ability to always have a finger somehow in the shot, covering partially the lens, or had the absolutely most crazy framing where, people's heads would be at the very bottom of the frame line and everything else would be like a wall and ceiling. And that was with people. But everything else was a photograph of her garden or her flowers or the exterior of her house. Okay, so I've said to myself, I am going through these, and any picture that is not of a human being, I am throwing out, because no one cares about these photographs of her flowers and her house or the very tops of people's heads from my candy or her finger. Okay. By the way, I thought you were going to say that you threw out all the pictures with people in them. No, right? But interesting, you came to that conclusion, because this is what I'm getting to, is that, yeah, those pictures to the average human being, obviously to people who didn't take photographs, have no relevance. Okay, you look at 3 pictures of that same plant that my mom grew, and you're like, okay, I get it. I don't need 200 of them. Okay, so you throw them out, and yet you say to yourself, but this meant something to her in that moment, right? And there was no thought in the way of the plant. Well, at least not that she perceived anyway, because back then, the viewfinders were different, right? This is a lesson for every user. That's right. Do not ever use a rangefinder, and right. You don't really see everything that you think you're seeing, or sometimes you see more than you think you're seeing. But nonetheless, so as I'm like throwing out all these pictures, and I'm talking like probably thousands of pictures I'm throwing out, right? I'm thinking to myself, okay, now AI, all right, let's just say that, and this is going way beyond where I think AI is right now, but I think we'll probably someday have the capability of doing, if it could ingest all of that imagery, okay, all the horrible, terrible, worthless photographs to the average person, okay, all those pictures of my mom's fingers in front of them, or that were out of focus, or that where the flash was overexposed, or whatever, and tell its own story of that. Create moving, relatable moments, which I think it can do. Now that stuff has value, because what it has done, it has recreated a living moment based, yes, on the technology, but it has taken a moment which, as a poorly rendered single still photograph of literally no interest to most people who would look at it, could change it into a story moment. Well, and so I agree with you. I don't think we're there yet, but I will give you an example. Like, for example, I have to write a lot of briefs, and there is AI now where you feed it 5, 10, or 15 things you've written in the past, and then you still have to feed it something you've written currently, but you can tell it to transform it into your own style. And so I don't think they're that far off of what you're talking about, which is essentially the same thing and said visually. But I do wonder how much of that would be a story created by AI or just a summary?
No. Let me throw two things at you, because these intersect both something we talked about earlier and something that occurred to me of what was making me think of this notion of taking, say, a bunch of disparate, boring photographs and giving life to them beyond what they were intended to. So first of all, there's that scene in the movie Blade Runner, right? Remember where the character of Deckard finds the photographs that belong to the replicant, and he's able to take that photograph and put it in this machine in his apartment and move the camera in 3D space and see things in other rooms that aren't even in the photograph, which gets us back to the Roman Polanski camera trick of putting that camera where people can't see something and yet making them want to peer around that corner. So for me, what I think would be the genius of AI is to take that moment and allow you to peer deeper into that moment. So let me start for one of that, because one of the first AI image making versions of DALL-E, when they advertised it, they had a picture of ChatGPT or DALL-E generated version of, for years, the girl with the curl area. And if you remember the painting, the girl is painted on black background. So what DALL-E did was it dropped the black background and they did I think 180-degree view of the room she's sitting in. So she's sitting in front of an open window and you can see Bernier's, supposedly the background of his studio. Mm-hmm. All his brushes are lying around. When you look out a window is the 1600s in Delft. But is it, or is it just an amalgamation of what it predicts from its training of what the top floor of a Dutch row house looked like in the 1600s? And I will counter with, doesn't matter. And I say that because, okay, you look at a situation, if we're going to use the Vermeer painting as an example, okay, we don't know what that looked like, right? There's no way, I mean, nobody's alive who would have remembered what Vermeer was doing or what the room even looked like. Even if he painted it in a room, who knows where he painted? He could have painted it from memory. You know what I mean? Nobody knows. No one knows the story of that girl. That could have been a composite of something that was in his subconscious. And it's idealized vision of a woman, not somebody he knew, but somebody who he imagined. We don't know that, right? So again, it's like, if that is art, then AI can interpret whatever is behind that photograph and however it chooses to create its own art in that moment, or how it is spontaneously, if we're going to attribute spontaneity to AI, to imagine what it could be, okay? And to me, that is, in its own way, a form of creativity. Okay, I'm not arguing about whether it's a form of creativity. I'm sure it is. I mean, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, well, you can generate that picture by typing a 90-word prompt, and you're pretty creative. You should just say it's 910 words, right? But to the question I had, because
Verrier, I used Verrier on purpose because during World War II, he, Hans and Nevering, a Dutch forger, created paintings and then sold them to the Nazis, claiming they were Verriers. And there's a really good movie on this. Yes. The Lost Verrier. Yes. And when you hear Guy Pearce, I think, plays the forger, and when you hear him talk about forgery, and he talks about the fact that it's not so much about copying, so it looks exactly the same. What he did was he painted paintings that never were painted by Verrier, subjects that were never painted by Verrier, but that the experts always assumed had been painted by Verrier, and just lost to time because Verrier has so few authenticated pictures, right? And so he painted biblical scenes because that was what the other Dutch masters had all gone through some religious phase, but there was none from him, right? So they must have existed and be lost. And Van Meeker's point was, I can paint with the same color palette. I can paint scenes that people are familiar with. And then I can say it was Verrier. And all the experts will say, oh, yes, look, see, we were right. There really was a religious phase to Verrier's career. And we've now located all these paintings. Never mind the fact that in one of the pictures, I think she painted either Jesus or one of the apostles with a striking resemblance to Herman Goering, and then sold it to him for an outrageous amount. I think all because he knew subconsciously that if you make people look like things that they recognize, they will like it better. So my question is, how is that any different than AI generated pictures? In particularly in what you were talking about, like it's been fed all your mom's pictures, and right, isn't it just copying or forging?
So that's the end of part one, and we'll leave it with a cliffhanger. And for the answer to the last question, you'll have to tune in next week. I want to thank you for tuning into the Subconscious Photography Podcast today. If our journey through the art and science of photography has captivated you, please subscribe to the podcast, share it with friends, and leave us a positive review. We're excited to continue this exploration with you, and you can visit us at www.subconscious-photography.com for more episodes. You can take a look at some of my rotating and random favorite photographs that I've shot recently. And you can also email us your comments and experiences directly through the website. Your insights and support are invaluable to this community. Please listen to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, soon to be YouTube Podcasts, or whatever your preferred podcast provider may be. Please join us next time for the answer to that question and the rest of my interview with Scott Whitham, Storyteller, and for more adventures in subconscious photography. Again, I'm David Senoff, your host, and thank you for joining us.